Today we're about to embark on the journey through some of the eeriest episodes that have haunted our collective past. From ghostly legends that defy explanation, to dark secrets buried beneath centuries of dust, these stories will send shivers down your spine and make you rethink everything you thought you knew about history. So grab your favourite snack and turn off the lights as we unravel these chilling historical tales. First, we are going back to look at one of England's most infamous ghosts. Over the centuries, there have been several ghost sightings at Raynham Hall, many of which are credible written accounts. Also, it was here that one of the most famous ghost photographs in the world was taken. Most agree that the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall is the ghost of Dorothy Townsend. So to get a better understanding of this tale, let's dive into her life. Dorothy Walpole was born on the 18th of September 1686 at Horton Hall, a country house in Norfolk, England. Her father, Robert Walpole, was an influential Whig politician and colonel in the militia, and her mother was a woman named Mary Burwell. The couple had a total of 19 children, many of whom went on to have notable careers. For example, Dorothy's older brother was Sir Robert Walpole, who is generally regarded as the first Prime Minister of Great Britain. But the family may well be best remembered today thanks to Sir Robert Walpole's son, Horace, who is the author of The Castle of Otranto, the world's first Gothic novel. In any case, given the family's wealth and prominence, Dorothy would have been brought up in luxury and received a good education, learning many skills which were required for society ladies, such as music, sewing, reading and writing. As a young lady, Dorothy is believed to have fallen in love with a Viscount Charles Townsend, a man 12 years her senior. However, Dorothy's father forbade the match, possibly because he did not want it to appear as though he was forcing the nobleman to wed his daughter. Well, he had been young Charles's guardian years earlier, following his father's death when he was just 13. It should also be noted that at this time, young Dorothy was only around 12 or 13 years of age, so she was very young. Eventually, Charles Townsend married Elizabeth Pelham in 1698. The couple went on to have 5 children, yet she died prematurely in 1711, at 30 years of age. This now allowed him to rekindle his relationship with Dorothy, and possibly ask for her hand. Nevertheless, Dorothy hadn't been idle all these years. While she wasn't married, she had become the mistress of Thomas Wharton, 1st Marquis of Wharton, a politician who was known for his immense charm and for being a fine public speaker. Yet he was also a notorious rake, who had a debauched and irreligious character, and was described as a man void of moral or religious principles. Despite her liaison with the married noble, she soon reconnected with her former love, and they were married in 1713. The couple went on to have at least 11 children, born between 1714 and 1726, 6 of which survived into adulthood. From the outside, all seemed to be going well, yet Dorothy, who was now the Viscountess Townsend, was about to face a terrible fate. As the story goes, rumours of the liaison between Lady Dorothy and Lord Wharton from years earlier began to reach Charles Townsend. Although Lord Wharton had died back in 1715, it was only now that Charles Townsend was learning of the adultery his wife had committed with the notorious rake. Townsend was furious. He had a fierce temper, and historians have described him as being a passionate man who loved and hated quickly and rarely changed his mind once an opinion had been formed. As a result, he locked his wife in an isolated room from the rest of the house, where she remained as a prisoner. She was never to leave, and wasn't allowed to see her children. It's believed that she was locked away in Raynham Hall for the rest of her life. According to legal records, she died in 1726 of smallpox, though as she died under mysterious circumstances, there were rumours of a more violent death, with some believing that she was pushed down the hall's great staircase, breaking her neck. She was 39 years of age at the time and was subsequently buried. Yet legend has it that she didn't actually die at this time, and that her funeral was a sham. It's suspected that Lady Dorothy remained in prison in Raynham Hall for many years after 1726, until her eventual death, possibly from starvation. Years passed, and her life and the mysterious tale surrounding it faded into obscurity. But this would all change in the 19th century, when many visitors to Raynham Hall reported seeing a lady in a dated brown dress walking the halls at night. It's been claimed that in 1815, the Prince Regent, later King George IV, saw this himself. Apparently he declared, "I will not pass another hour in this accursed house, for I have seen that what I hope to God I may never see again." As with everyone else, he would have seen how this figure seemingly appeared out of the blue and then vanished into thin air. And the eerie thing about these sightings is that all claim that the brown lady bore a strong resemblance to a portrait of Lady Dorothy that hung in a bedroom. 20 years later, in 1835, a Christmas gathering was held at Raynham Hall, and various guests were invited to join in the Christmas festivities. Among the guests were a Colonel Loftus and a Mr. Hawkins, who claimed that one night, as they approached their bedrooms, they had seen the brown lady, noting in particular the dated brown dress she wore. The following evening, Loftus claimed to have seen her again, this time reporting that she had dark, empty eye sockets and a glowing face. These sightings terrified the staff, leading many to leave their jobs. The following year, Captain Frederick Marriott, a Royal Navy officer, novelist and friend to Charles Dickens, stayed a few nights in Raynham Hall. He specifically requested the room where Lady Dorothy's portrait was, in order to prove that the brown lady wasn't real, and that the ghost sightings were due to smugglers at Raynham. Florence Marriott, who was the captain's daughter, wrote the following of his experience. He took possession of the room in which the portrait of the apparition hung, and in which she had often been seen, and slept each night with a loaded revolver under his pillow. For 2 days, however, he saw nothing, and the third was to be the limit of his stay. On the third night, however, 2 young men knocked at his door as he was undressing to go to bed, and asked him to step over to their room, which was at the other end of the corridor, and give them his opinion on a new gun just arrived from London. My father was in his shirt and trousers, but as the hour was late, and everybody had retired to rest, except themselves, he prepared to accompany them as he was. As they were leaving the room, he caught up his revolver. "In case you meet the brown lady," he said, laughing. When the inspection of the gun was over, the young men in the same spirit declared they would accompany my father back again. "In case you meet the brown lady," they repeated, laughing also. The 3 gentlemen therefore returned in company. The corridor was long and dark, for the lights had been extinguished, but as they reached the middle of it, they saw the glimmer of a lamp coming towards them from the other end. "One of the ladies going to visit the nurseries," whispered the young Townsends to my father. Now, the bedroom doors in that corridor faced each other, and each room had a double door with a space between, as is the case in many old-fashioned houses. My father, as I've said, was in shirt and trousers only, and his native modesty made him feel uncomfortable, so he slipped within one of the outer doors, his friends following his example, in order to conceal himself until the lady should have passed by. I have heard him describe how he watched her approaching nearer and nearer through the chink of the door, until, as she was close enough for him to distinguish the colours and style of her costume, he recognised the figure as the facsimile of the portrait of the brown lady. He had his finger on the trigger of his revolver, and was about to demand it to stop and give the reason for its presence there, when the figure halted of its own accord before the door behind which he stood, and holding the lighted lamp she carried to her features, grinned in a malicious and diabolical manner at him. This act so infuriated my father, who was anything but lamb-like in disposition, that he sprang into the corridor with a bound and discharged the revolver right in her face. The figure instantly disappeared, and the bullet passed through the outer door of the room onto the opposite side of the corridor, and lodged in the panel of the inner one. My father never attempted again to interfere with the Brown Lady of Raynham. After this encounter, sightings of the Brown Lady decreased significantly, and the next recorded sighting wasn't until 1926, when the Lady Townsend's son and his friend allegedly spotted the ghost on the staircase. They also said that what they had seen resembled the portrait of Lady Dorothy Townsend. In 1936, the tale of the Brown Lady came to national attention when the photographer Captain Hubert C. Provand, along with his assistant Indre Shearer, began taking photographs of Raynham Hall for Country Life magazine. As with any other job, they tried to get the best shots possible, but while they were photographing the grand staircase, a vapory form gradually assuming the appearance of a woman moved towards them. It was a Brown Lady. Shearer stated the following regarding this: "Captain Provand took one photograph while I flashed the light. He was focusing for another exposure. I was standing by his side, just behind the camera, with the flashlight pistol in my hand, looking directly up the staircase. All at once, I detected an ethereal veiled form coming slowly down the stairs. Rather excitedly, I called out sharply, 'Quick, quick, there's something!' I pressed the trigger of the flashlight pistol. After the flash, and on closing the shutter, Captain Provand removed the focusing cloth from his head and turning to me said, 'What's all the excitement about?' After this, the two developed the photographs, and it was now that they realised that they had captured an image of the infamous Brown Lady. 3 months after their encounter at Raynham Hall, an article was published in Country Life magazine which contained Provand and Shearer's ghostly experience, as well as the photograph of the Brown Lady. This story was published in Life magazine just weeks later, and as a result, the photograph of the Brown Lady became the most famous ghost picture in the world. Nevertheless, one organisation, the Society for Psychical Research, wasn't convinced, and they were determined to discover the truth. Their investigator was a Mr. C.V.C. Herbert, and he interviewed Provand and Shearer about what had occurred. He noted that Shearer was a nervous and superstitious Scotsman, wasn't a very good photographer, was more interested in business, used a pseudonym, and interestingly, had told Lady Townsend that he hoped of photographing a ghost. When Herbert spoke to Captain Provand, the conversation mainly centred on the camera. Herbert examined the photograph and found anomalies towards the edges of the frame. He also noted that it seemed as if the camera had been shaken, and it also looked like the staircase had accidentally been photographed twice, to which Provand replied that the camera was in fact placed on a slightly unsteady marble table, and that when he removed the lens, he did it very quickly, and this could explain the shakiness of the exposure. In Herbert's mind, what they had captured wasn't the Brown Lady, but was actually a mistake from the photographers. Despite Herbert's skeptical report, many experts were satisfied with the pair's explanation, and even the prominent Harry Price gave them the benefit of the doubt, saying, "I could not shake their story, and I had no right to disbelieve them." Yet others claimed it was a fake. Although manipulating photos in 1936 seems impossible when compared to the technology today, it was doable. Critics have given various explanations as to how the image was a hoax. These include putting grease on the lens in the shape of a figure, moving down the stairs during an exposure, a double exposure, or a simple superimposition of the Madonna statue onto the empty staircase. Thus, while the photograph may not be real, the life of Dorothy Townsend certainly was, and the subsequent haunting which occurred makes one wonder what exactly was going on at Raynham Hall which led to all of these recorded sightings over the centuries. In any case, real or not, the story of the Brown Lady and her basis in history certainly makes for a very interesting tale. Next, We are going to 19th century Sweden. Carolina Olsen was born on the 29th of October 1861 on the island of Okno in southern Sweden. This island lies off the coast of Monsteras, a locality in the province of Kalmar in southern Sweden. The island is small, and the only major settlement there is a town also called Okno. The remote location on a remote island would only add to the mystery surrounding Olsen's life story in the years that followed. Little is known about Carolina's early life, and Okno was certainly not the kind of place which generated much by way of scandal or sensation in the mid-19th century. The Olsen family were typical of the island. Carolina's father was a fisherman, the industry which the community was based around, while her mother was a housewife. She was the second eldest of 5 children in a family which just about managed to subsist in the circumstances of a poor fishing community. Her 4 siblings were all boys. The world would never have heard of Carolina Olsen had it not been for the events of the 18th of February 1876. That day, 14-year-old Carolina hit her head while out on the ice of a late winter freeze on Okno. She developed a toothache immediately afterwards. Isolated rural communities like Okno were still prone to extreme superstitions in the second half of the 19th century, and Carolina's family began to believe that a hex or some malign spell had been placed on her by a local witch when the toothache did not subside. And then, on the 22nd of February, 4 days after her fall, Carolina went to bed and, by all accounts, did not wake up for 32 years. The Olsen family were, quite unsurprisingly, not sure how to deal with this latest twist of fate. For a small, isolated community like this in the 19th century, there was no knowledge base to draw on to try and determine what might be happening to poor Carolina, and the family were too poor to afford to pay for a physician or consultant to be brought from the mainland to examine the sleeping teenager. As a result, they fell back on local folk medicine and the advice of the island's midwife. Carolina's mother would force-feed her glasses of sweetened milk and water every day, in the hope that this would wake her from her slumber, or at least keep her alive until she awoke. Eventually, the community at Okno banded together to try and collect money to hire a doctor to come to Okno and assess the situation. However, his medical expertise brought no relief. The physician determined that Carolina was in a coma, and despite using smelling salts and even jabbing her with needles to try and force a reaction, he couldn't wake her. The best he could do was give the Olsens a bottle of tonic, which he advised them to give her daily to keep her body ticking along while she slept. He then left, though he continued to visit weekly thereafter to observe the situation. As he did, the situation changed slightly. Occasionally, Carolina was said to sit up in bed and begin mumbling prayers in a kind of half stupor, while other reports assert that she would sometimes sleepwalk. However, Carolina was never known to reach full consciousness, even if she began moving about. Realizing that he had no answers for Carolina's condition himself, the first doctor who visited soon began writing letters to newspapers all around Sweden and leading medical journals in hope that some doctor in Stockholm or elsewhere, one with greater training than himself, would read about Carolina's case and possibly have an answer as to what was happening to the girl who was increasingly becoming known as Soverskampa Okno, or the Sleeper of Okno. Soon these stories drew more doctors who arrived to Okno hoping to solve the case and awaken the teenager, but they had little success. No one could wake her, though multiple theories as to what was happening abounded. Some believed she was in some sort of peculiar hibernation. Others claimed Carolina was suffering from a strange psychological disorder, though the field of psychology was in its infancy in the late 19th century, and few had any hypotheses as to what it might be. Others suggested she was comatose, or in a state of profound shock about something, while more still proposed that she was actually acting, and that the entire thing was an elaborate hoax being perpetrated by both Carolina and her family. Other unusual features of her case were also noted. For instance, despite her endless slumber, Carolina's hair and nails never seemed to grow and did not need to be cut, while she also continued to seemingly awaken periodically, only to keep her eyes closed and mumble some prayers before returning to bed. Soon the years began to pass, and still Carolina remained asleep. As they did, the methods of trying to wake her became more extreme. In 1892, when she was 30, by which point she had been asleep for 16 years, Carolina was taken to Oskarsham, a large town on the mainland with its own hospital. Here she was treated using electroconvulsive shock therapy, but when this too failed to garner any result, doctors effectively gave up. She was returned to Okno, and there would be no further attempt to solve her situation. Well, all the solutions available in the late 19th century had been exhausted. In 1904, 28 years into her hibernation, Carolina's mother dropped dead, no doubt exhausted from years of caring for her comatose, slumbering daughter. Some stories have it that Carolina woke enough to begin weeping when her mother died, but this may well be an embellishment. In any event, some female neighbours began to aid in Carolina's care and watched over her, while her father and some of her brothers were out on the fishing boats of Okno. It is a pity that her mother died in 1904, for had she survived a few more years, she would have lived long enough to see her daughter escape her perpetual nightmare. On the 3rd of April 1908, at the age of 47, just over 32 years after she first went to sleep, Carolina Olsen suddenly awoke to the astonishment of her father, 2 brothers and neighbours. When she awoke, Carolina was informed that her mother was dead, as were 2 of her brothers, who had both drowned out at sea over the years. As her situation revealed itself to her, and as she looked in the mirror, in which she barely recognised herself, Carolina began to weep. Given what had happened over the years, her case now generated massive attention in Sweden and internationally, as it was reported from Stockholm to London and Paris that the sleeper of Okno, whom people might have remembered from the newspapers 30 years earlier, had finally arisen. For her part, Carolina agreed to undergo a psychiatric evaluation and medical testing in Stockholm. During these, her mental faculties were determined to be entirely intact, while she had not noticed the transition of 32 years, and was effectively waking as though she was still a 14-year-old girl rather than 47 years of age. The physicians at the time noted that she looked extremely youthful for her age, appearing to be no older than 25. But there was no consensus reached as to what had actually happened to her, or the explanation behind her bizarre 32-year sleep. So, what might explain Carolina Olsen's malady? All of the medical explanations which were theorized at the time, whether it was hysteria, dementia, a coma, or some psychological disorder, have been dismissed since. However, one possible explanation is that she was suffering from a very severe case of Kleine-Levin syndrome. Kleine-Levin syndrome is a very rare disorder which is generally characterized by bouts of excessive sleep, or what is called hypersomnolence. Normally, this manifests as a person sleeping for upwards of 20 hours per day, but in some instances, it can see a person sleeping for days on end. When they wake, the sufferer may exhibit irrationality, lethargy, or even seem extremely disoriented, conditions which might explain the supposed bouts of waking which Carolina experienced, and during which it was claimed she began praying or sleepwalking. The exact cause of the syndrome is not entirely clear even today, and the condition was undiagnosed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries while Carolina Olsen was sleeping at Okno. Hereditary factors may contribute to the appearance of it, with some individuals simply having a genetic disposition to developing the syndrome. It may also be owing to a brain malfunction of the hypothalamus, the part of the brain which regulates sleep, appetite, and body temperature. The disorder can be very cyclical and sporadic. For instance, someone who suffers from it can go through weeks or months where they are very badly affected, and then it becomes as though they never had the syndrome at all. Moreover, the symptoms are often brought on by a severe incident, like banging one's head, as Carolina did on the 18th of February 1876, while they also tend to alleviate the appearance of aging, such as occurred in 1908 when Carolina Olsen awoke and looked over 20 years younger than she was in reality. Another typical aspect of the Kleiner-Levin syndrome includes an excessive appetite when one wakes, although these were not present at all in Carolina's case. However, if there is an explanation for the sleeper of Okno's case, then Kleiner-Levin syndrome may be it. There is also a possibility that the entire episode was a highly elaborate hoax. In 1910, Carolina met with a psychiatrist called Dr. Freudenstrom. After assessing her condition, he published a paper on her condition in 1912, in which he stated that it was an unclear case of hibernation, but there was evidence that Olsen did periodically wake up and would express sorrow and anger. It is unclear if this was a reference to her periodic sleepwalking and mumbled prayers, but Freudenstrom speculated that Olsen was a severe hypochondriac who believed following her accident in 1876 that she was seriously ill, and that thereafter she remained still with her eyes closed to elicit sympathy. Those who have argued that it was a ruse or hoax of some kind along these lines note that her mother possibly helped her in her deception, and after she died, one of her brothers took over this role. Then, when this carer died in 1907, she abandoned the fabrication altogether shortly thereafter. As with the theory that she was suffering from Kleiner-Levin syndrome, the idea that her 32-year hibernation was simply an elaborate hoax also remained unproven, though it seems difficult to believe that she could have deceived the doctors who administered the electroshock therapy to her in 1892. Following the initial flurry of medical tests, Carolina attempted to return to Okno and live with her father and two remaining brothers. However, the case of the sleeper of Okno generated such interest that their little cottage on the sleepy Swedish island was inundated with so many visitors and newspapermen that they left their home and settled elsewhere for a time. Eventually, many months later, they returned to their island. Carolina lived out a long life here. She died on the 5th of April 1950 at the age of 88, occasionally being visited by people who were interested in seeing the famed sleeper of Okno in the flesh. Her case remains unsolved to this day. Now let us go to Germany, where a mysterious couple became the talk of the town. The mystery of the Dunkelgrafen begins on the 7th of February, 1807. That day, a covered carriage arrived at the town of Hildburghausen in Thuringia in central Germany. When it arrived, a couple got out. The man was in his late 30s at the time, but the woman was some years younger, perhaps nearing her 30th year, or so observers would have estimated at the time. Who were they? Many in the town asked. But in the years that followed, virtually nothing was uncovered, and instead, the mystery simply deepened. The mysterious couple took up residence in a modest dwelling in Hildburghausen over the next 3 years. He went by the title and name of Count Wawel de Versailles, while pains were taken to never reveal her identity. There was little explanation about who they were and where they had come from. Most curiously, why were a count and his female companion, whom he stressed was not his wife or partner of any kind, relocating to the remote Hildburghausen? Were they perhaps hiding from something, or from someone? In 1810, the couple moved into Eishausen Castle, near the town but in a secluded region, and when they did, they largely remained there. They rarely, if ever, left the castle, and lived a kind of self-imposed exile outside Hildburghausen. On those rare occasions when they did leave Eishausen, the woman in particular was elusive, usually riding wherever she needed to go in a carriage and with a veil covering her face. This went on for a long time, and the villagers of Hildburghausen and the surrounding region soon began to refer to the couple as the Dunkle Grafen, or Dark Counts, on account of the shadowy nature of their identity. After decades of reclusion in Eishausen Castle, she eventually died on the 28th of November 1837, while the supposed count lived a further 8 years until 1845. At the time of her death, the woman was recorded as Sophie Botter, and she was buried on Schulersberg Hill near the castle in a garden which the couple had purchased several years earlier. The count was laid to rest in the churchyard of Eishausen, while the castle was torn down in 1873 after lying vacant for some years. This was all very peculiar. The couple had died having lived in the region under strange circumstances for upwards of 40 years in the case of the count. Thus, even years after their deaths, the residents of Hildburghausen continued to wonder who the strangers who had lived in their midst for so many years had been, and one theory above all became popular. Following the count's death in 1845, it was soon revealed that the man had actually not been a count at all. Rather, he was a Dutchman by the name of Leonardus Cornelius van der Valk, who had acted as a secretary in the Dutch embassy in Paris between the summer of 1798 and the spring of 1799. So why had he lied and pretended to be a minor aristocrat? Also, if he wasn't a count, but rather a humble bureaucrat, how would he and his female companion have been able to purchase a castle and live there without working or earning an income for decades? The answer many people increasingly believed was that the man was a lifelong chaperone of sorts for none other than Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, the daughter of King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette of France, both of whom had been killed by the French Revolutionary government back in 1793 following the French Revolution. Let's backtrack to consider who Marie-Thérèse was. She was born at the Palace of Versailles outside Paris on the 19th of December 1778, the eldest child of King Louis XVI and his Austrian-born queen, Marie Antoinette. Marie-Thérèse was the only one of her parents' 3 children who would survive into adulthood. She had 2 younger brothers, Louis Joseph, born in 1781, and Louis Charles, born in 1785, both of whom succumbed to tuberculosis when they were 7 and 10 years of age respectively, though Louis Charles's death may have been accelerated by inhumane treatment at the hands of the revolutionary government in Paris in the early 1790s. In 1789, the French Revolution broke out across France. By the end of the year, Marie-Thérèse and her parents were being held under house arrest in Paris by the revolutionaries. For a time, Louis and Marie were allowed to remain as king and queen of the country as figureheads, but when they continued to conspire with foreign governments to have Austria, Britain and other countries intervene in France on their behalf, the French government eventually decided to place the monarch and his consort on trial. Both were found guilty of treason and executed in the course of 1793. With the death of her little brother 2 years later, Marie-Thérèse was the last member of the family alive. By 1795, the former princess was deemed to pose little threat to the revolutionary government. The monarchy had been brought to an end, a republic had been established, and the French revolutionary armies had gone from being on the defensive against the British, Austrians and others to being on the offensive, conquering the Low Countries early that year and establishing the Batavian Republic there as a close ally. Consequently, the possibility of Marie-Thérèse being used by the foreign powers as a figurehead to re-establish the monarchy seemed remote, and she was allowed to leave France and head to her mother's family in Vienna in Austria. And here is where the plot thickens. Marie-Thérèse was incredibly traumatized by the years she had spent in captivity. There is no denying that. As a result, some people came to believe that the woman who arrived to Vienna in 1795 claiming to be Marie-Thérèse was in fact her foster sister. This woman was Ernestine de Lambriquet, a child of 2 royal servants who had worked at the Palace of Versailles in the 1770s and 1780s. Ernestine bore a resemblance to the royal children, and rumours abounded that King Louis was her actual father. Whatever the truth of this, she became a playmate of Marie-Thérèse, and when her mother died in 1788, the king and queen adopted her, although her father was still alive. During the tumultuous years which followed, Ernestine was not held captive with the rest of the royal family, but she was often mistaken for being Marie-Thérèse, and was insulted as she walked the streets of Paris. Such was the resemblance between her and the king and queen's biological daughter. And it was this resemblance which led many people to believe that, when Marie-Thérèse allegedly arrived to Vienna in 1795, it was actually Ernestine de Lambriquet pretending to be Marie-Thérèse. This theory suggests that Marie-Thérèse was so traumatized by the events of the years between 1789 and 1795 that when she was released, she simply wanted to spend her life in isolation, away from court circles and governments elsewhere, who would only try to use her as a pawn in the wars as the British, Austrians and others remained in conflict with France for much of the period down to 1815. Consequently, the theory of the Dunkelgrafen holds that the woman who was travelling around Europe's courts for decades after 1795 pretending to be Marie-Thérèse was actually Ernestine de Lambriquet, while the woman who pulled up in a carriage to Hildburghausen in the spring of 1807 and became known as the Dark Countess was actually the French princess, who had been in hiding away from the world, which had left her so traumatized. For many years the mystery continued to deepen. Research was conducted by many historians and hobbyists into the mysterious Dark Countess and the Dunkelgrafen. Much of this added to the speculation. For instance, it was revealed that the Austrian court had specifically requested that Ernestine de Lambriquet, Marie-Thérèse's childhood friend and companion, should be allowed to travel with her to Vienna in 1795. But at this time it was reported back that Ernestine could not be located. Perhaps many speculated this was because Ernestine was now in Paris, pretending to be Marie-Thérèse, and ready to head to Vienna as such. Additionally, research into the party of individuals who were believed to have travelled across Europe from Paris to Vienna with Marie-Thérèse in 1795 uncovered some highly unusual anomalies. Several members of the small party could not be identified, and some of them were said to have never reached Vienna. These curious circumstances did not prove anything, but they did serve to add further uncertainty to the surrounding events. Eventually, the speculation led to concerted efforts to uncover the truth, and modern science has created the possibility of being able to finally decipher the mystery of the Dunkelgrafen. Thus, in 2013, the grave of Sophie Botta, the Dark Countess, was excavated near Eishausen Castle. After her remains were exhumed, 2 small sections of her femur were sent to forensic labs in Austria and Germany to be analysed. Once this was done, the mitochondrial DNA was then assessed with that of Prince Alexander of Saxe-Cosafe, a contemporary descendant of Queen Marie Antoinette. If the Dark Countess was Marie-Thérèse, then Prince Alexander's mitochondrial DNA would be an exact match with that found in the remains located in Sophie Botta's grave next to Eishausen Castle. Unfortunately, the result proved immensely disappointing for many. It was discovered that the Dark Countess was not a relative of Queen Marie Antoinette, and so she couldn't have been Marie-Thérèse. Therefore, the mysterious couple who arrived to Hildburghausen in 1807 and lived there for over 30 years down to their deaths were probably exactly what they most obviously appeared to have been: an independently wealthy couple of individuals who wanted to live a reclusive life in a castle in rural Germany. This next case takes place in late 19th century France, where a notable socialite suddenly disappeared. Blanche Monnier was born on the 1st of March 1849 in the town of Poitiers in Vienne in western France. The Monnier were a well-established bourgeois family of the town, ones with minor aristocratic pretensions, in a time when France's nobility was experiencing a revitalization following the fierce republicanism of the late 18th century. Blanche's father was Émile Monnier, the head of the arts faculty in the local university, while her mother, Louise Monnier, was a well-known French socialite. Émile Monnier was also an individual who had earned a prestigious Committee of Good Works award. This was a merit which was granted in 19th century France to individuals who were perceived to have made significant contributions to their communities and to be possessed of high virtue. Moreover, the family had connections to high society in Paris. Thus, Blanche Monnier was born into a family which, to all outward appearances, were upstanding members of the community in Poitiers. Yet her story would prove that they were anything but. Blanche's early years were largely unremarkable. She went to school, moved in the society circles of Poitiers, and often visited Paris, which was just 4 hours away. As she entered her adult years, she developed into a striking beauty, with curly hair, fair skin and big, bright eyes. But a dreadful fate awaited her. In the mid-1870s, as she was entering her mid-20s, Blanche met and fell in love with a young man from Poitiers. Although he was a lawyer, a profession typically known for high salaries, the man came from a humble background and had few clients in the confined society of the provincial town. Moreover, he was substantially older than Blanche. As such, while he would make a perfectly adequate living, Blanche's parents were unimpressed with him as a potential marriage match for their daughter. Instead, they imagined her marrying into the minor nobility of Western France, or such were her good looks, even forming a union with a member of Paris's high society as the country entered the Belle Epoque. Blanche, however, remained smitten with her older suitor, and it was her reluctance to abandon the relationship which led to her acquiring a fame of a kind which no person would rightfully wish for. Her unwillingness to end the relationship with what her mother termed the penniless lawyer led her parents, with the aid of Blanche's brother Marcel, to lock her in a small room in their large house in Poitiers on the 1st of March 1875, which happened to be Blanche's 26th birthday. Confined to this small chamber, the Monniers told their daughter that they would only release her once she agreed to end the relationship and give up any thoughts of marrying her lawyer suitor. The matter might have ended shortly after this, but for some reason, which is not entirely clear, it didn't. And as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Blanche remained in prison in a small room in her parents' house in Poitiers. In time, for reasons which to this day are still not 100% clear, it turned into a permanent imprisonment. As we will see shortly, this was a ghastly confinement. One might wonder at this point how Blanche could have disappeared without anyone raising any suspicions or seeking to determine where she had gone. In response, it might be said that there were many individuals who did inquire after her well-being in the weeks and months that followed after she first disappeared in the spring of 1875. Neighbours were concerned, as were her friends, and Blanche's loyal lover tried to ascertain her whereabouts. But in time, the inquiry ceased. Nobody would have thought that one of the most respected families in Poitiers had imprisoned a family member in a room and simply decided to leave her jailed there indefinitely. Moreover, if anybody did bring her disappearance to the attention of the authorities, they evidently dismissed the reports. Perhaps people simply believed Blanche had headed for the sunnier climes of Paris. As the years went by, Blanche continued to remain imprisoned in her parents' home in Poitiers. While it seems relatively clear that Blanche's mother was primarily responsible for the awful circumstances in which she had placed her daughter, it is quite evident that other family members were also involved, though her father Émile's role came to an end when he died in 1879, 4 years after Blanche had been locked inside the room. Thereafter, it was primarily Louise Monnier and her son, Blanche's brother Marcel, who were engaged in keeping Blanche under lock and key. Her imprisonment was brutal. The room she was confined to year after year was an attic room. It had a small window, though this had been blacked out, and there was no natural light of any kind there. The door was kept locked from the outside, and Blanche was wholly reliant on whatever her captors provided for her own survival. The true extent of the horrendous conditions would be revealed in due course. Meanwhile, as the years passed, the original reasons for imprisoning the young woman disappeared. The lawyer whom she had been courting, and whose relationship with her had been the apparent reason for her detention by her family, died in 1885, nearly a decade after she was first imprisoned. Why her mother and brother continued to keep her in this torturous situation thereafter remains a mystery. Perhaps they believed that if they released her, she would report them to the authorities, and this was a risk they were not willing to take, especially as they were a recognised family in Poitiers. Nevertheless, it continued year after year. After a certain point, the residents of their locality in Poitiers must have largely forgotten about her, and her former friends and acquaintances too. That said, there were occasional incidents which people noted as being strange many years later. For instance, in the 1900s, a neighbour recounted an episode in 1892 when she believed that she heard a woman shouting from the Monnier house. At the time, she had dismissed it, but later, when it was revealed exactly what had occurred there, it all made much more sense. Evidently, someone had gotten wind of what was happening, and over 25 years after Blanche was first imprisoned, some anonymous hero came to her rescue. On the 23rd of May 1901, an Attorney General of the City of Paris received an unsigned letter which related Blanche Monnier's predicament in the following manner. Monsieur Attorney General, I have the honour to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house, half-starved and living on a putrid litter for the past 25 years. In a word, in her own filth. In the light of reports of Blanche's condition in the days that followed, it is evident that, whoever this anonymous informant was, they had witnessed firsthand the conditions which persisted in the room she was imprisoned in, but the identity of her saviour remains unknown to this day. The Parisian and Poitevin police moved quickly on foot of this disturbing report. Within days, they entered the Monnier household and began searching it from top to bottom. For some time they found nothing out of the ordinary as they traversed the lower floors, but after a period, they came to a door that was padlocked from the outside. The police wasted no time, and instead of delaying until the Monniers produced a key, they broke down the door. What they entered was a scene of horror. The smell was the first thing they noticed, a noxious putrid odour produced by decades of filth that had not been removed by Blanche's captors. However, it was only when they removed the curtains, heavy with dust, from over the small window, and then broke off the heavy shuttering which had prevented any light from coming through for 26 years, that they realised the full extent of the evil which had occurred here. Blanche was lying completely naked in a room which was full of filth. Fragments of rotting food lay around the room. The air was putrid, and there were bugs running around the place. Blanche was absolutely terrified by the intrusion of these strangers into her prison after over a quarter of a century of confinement there. Unfortunately, her mind was completely gone, and she weighed just over 25 kilos, or approximately 4 stone. The police report afterwards gave a full account of what they encountered. We immediately gave the order to open the casement window. This was done with great difficulty, for the old dark-coloured curtains fell down in a heavy shower of dust. To open the shutters, it was necessary to remove them from their right hinges. As soon as light entered the room, we noticed in the back, lying on a bed, her head and body covered by a repulsively filthy blanket, a woman identified as Mademoiselle Blanche Monnier. The unfortunate woman was lying completely naked on a rotten straw mattress. All around her was formed of a sort of crust made from excrement, fragments of meat, vegetables, fish, and rotten bread. We also saw oyster shells and bugs running across Mademoiselle Monnier's bed. The air was so unbreathable. The odour given off by the room was so rank that it was impossible for us to stay any longer to proceed with our investigation. In the hours that followed, the police and medical authorities removed Blanche from this room of horrors. Her mother and brother were both immediately arrested. As word spread, a crowd gathered outside the house and remained there for days on end, calling for the head of Louise and Marcel Monnier. Unfortunately, no justice was to come. Blanche's elderly mother died of a heart attack days later, escaping the punishment she so richly deserved. Then it transpired that Marcel Monnier was largely psychologically incapacitated himself, and while he was originally sentenced to 15 months in prison, he was subsequently acquitted and set free. After the trial, Marcel sold all the assets of his mother's estate and retired to Cibourg, a commune in the southwest of the country. He also had a country house in central France, where he eventually died in June 1913. Blanche never recovered, though there was some limited progress and at least some medical staff were able to afford her some humane care in the years that followed. She was 52 years of age at the time that she was rescued and would live for a further 12 years. These were spent at a psychiatric hospital in the town of Blois in central France. However, she was plagued by several psychological disorders, notably anorexia and schizophrenia. Her imprisonment had also impacted on her in many other ways. For instance, she had developed an extreme aversion to strong light as a result of being denied sunlight for over a quarter of a century. Blanche died on the 13th of October 1913. She was 64 years of age and had spent nearly her entire adult life either imprisoned or confined to a psychiatric hospital as a result of the mental scars of her earlier confinement. Her story was widely reported on in the early 1900s in France, but it was also retold and became known to a new generation in 1930 when the French author André Gide, a recipient of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1947, wrote about it in his novel La Séquestrée de Poitiers, meaning The Confined Woman of Poitiers. This was a semi-fictionalized version of Blanche's story in which Gide changed the main protagonists' names, but little else. Gide's account subsequently influenced Michel Foucault when he came to writing Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, one of his most significant works. As such, Blanche Monnier's horrendous story has had a considerable afterlife in 20th century French literature. For our final story, we are taking a trip back to the mid-17th century and looking at one of France's most infamous murder scandals. Catherine Dillet, known more famously as La Voisin, was born around the year 1640 in Paris. Due to a lack of records, information regarding her early life is almost non-existent, but it's likely that she grew up poor with a limited education. As a young girl, it's believed that little Catherine earned a few coins on the streets by telling the fortunes of anyone interested. She claimed that she had been taught the art of fortune-telling at the age of 9, but it's unknown by whom. In any case, most of her predictions turned out to be true. This talent, which she considered God-given powers, would allow her to make a name for herself in Paris, but it later led her down a dark path. When Catherine was around 20 years old, she married Antoine Monvoisin. Her husband was a businessman who tried his luck as a silk merchant, as well as opening up a jewellery store in Paris, yet he had little success. Within a few years, Catherine became a well-known fortune teller, recognised for her accurate and useful predictions. Yet, she knew she could expand and earn more money if she could provide more services. So, she decided to acquire the necessary medical knowledge, allowing her to become a midwife. Although she did well for herself, Catherine, now known as La Voisin, had to provide for her children, husband, and mother. In need of more money, she began to offer abortions within her midwife services to any women who wanted it. At the time, abortions were illegal, meaning those who facilitated it ran the risk of conviction and punishment. It was because of this that she earned more ridding women of unwanted babies than delivering newborns. It's believed that when La Voisin had to deal with fetuses who had been aborted late in the pregnancy, she would burn them in her house furnace and then bury the remains in her garden. As word of her services spread, women higher up the social ladder began to request her help. This in turn led to La Voisin charging higher prices, thus earning more money. Eventually, she had so many clients that she even established a network of abortion providers, and her role as a midwife was simply a front for her illicit practice. Despite these services being a cardinal sin by Catholic Church teaching, La Voisin was known to regularly attend Mass. During this time, she carried on with her fortune-telling, which was still her priority. Nevertheless, in 1665, her abilities were questioned by a notable priest. She was interrogated in front of professors at Sorbonne University, where they asked her a series of questions to determine if her fortune-telling was legitimate. La Voisin was persuasive and claimed her fortune-telling was a gift from God. As a result, she was let go and continued to provide these services. Within a few years, La Voisin was earning large amounts due to the services she provided. In order to become even more appealing to her increasingly wealthy clients, she purchased finer clothing, particularly a special robe of crimson red velvet embroidered with eagles in gold. Although this cost her the hefty sum of 1,500 livres, it created a mystical atmosphere which led more people to believe her prophecies. By the late 1660s, La Voisin's clientele consisted of many French aristocrats. She was now a wealthy lady, yet it was hard work, as she spent virtually all day receiving clients at her home in Villeneuve-sur-Gravois. Despite her humble background, La Voisin mixed freely with many of the upper classes in Paris. She was known to host parties at her home, where she played the violin for guests, and even took on many wealthy lovers. These included a count, an architect, a magician, and a viscount, among others. On one occasion, one of her lovers by the name of Adam Lesage grew jealous of her husband, Antoine Montvoisin. He hoped to get rid of him by convincing La Voisin of poisoning him. Initially, La Voisin was on board with the plan, yet she later changed her mind. With her great success, La Voisin soon found herself entangled in a series of conflicts with Marie Bosse. She was also a fortune teller who also provided poisoning services and was apparently an alleged witch. They soon became bitter enemies. Whether it was this rivalry or petitions from clients that spurred La Voisin on to provide these services is unknown. Nevertheless, her fortune-telling eventually led to her practicing the dark arts, creating magical objects such as amulets and love powders, and lastly, supplying poisons. Throughout the years of fortune-telling, La Voisin noticed how the majority of her clients mainly decide three things: that a certain someone fall in love with them, the death of a family member so they could inherit, and lastly, that their spouses would die so they could marry someone else. Previously, La Voisin couldn't do anything to alter fate. However, she had acquired new abilities which could make her clients' wishes come true. To avoid criticism in case that their desires were not fulfilled, La Voisin stated that only certain wishes that were the will of God would come true. Furthermore, she began to encourage her clients to take certain steps so there was an increased chance of their desires coming true. These steps could include visiting the church of a saint, buying certain magical objects like amulets and love powders, or perhaps most radical of all, participating in a black mass. With the help of priests whom she employed, Voisin charged a hefty sum of cash to perform black masses in the catacombs near her house. These rituals were the opposite of a traditional Catholic mass, as it involved a naked woman lying down as if she were the altar. Then, a chalice was placed on her stomach, and a priest would hold a baby above, pouring its blood down into the cup, while those present prayed to Satan. Whether Voisin used dead or living infants is uncertain. However, it's known that she had many children at her disposal, as not only did she provide abortions late into pregnancy, but she also aided lower-class women who couldn't afford to raise a child to get rid of their newborns. Voisin's services had certainly become darker with time, and eventually she took the fatal leap of selling a variety of poisons to her clients who wished to end somebody's life. As she was a known underworld figure, it wasn't long until she had a network of poison providers working for her, yet this decision proved to be one that would haunt her. In 1667, Voisin was hired by a member of King Louis XIV's court, Madame de Montespan, to have the king fall in love with her. Montespan used aphrodisiacs on the king, seduced him with her charm, and lastly, participated in black masses in order to win his heart. To her delight, it worked, and by July of the same year, she became King Louis XIV's official mistress. Yet, just 2 years later, the king began a sporadic affair with Madame de Soubise. Although Montespan wasn't too troubled by this, in 1673, she noticed that the king was losing interest in her. Unable to accept this, she went to Voisin and again participated in satanic rituals to keep his love. However, as time passed, the king took on more lovers. It was becoming clear that King Louis was no longer interested in Montespan. This was confirmed by his relationship with Angelique de Fontage in 1679. Furious by this dismissal, Montespan again went to Voisin for help, but this time she had something much more sinister in mind. She asked Voisin to poison both Fontage and the king. Although initially hesitant, Voisin eventually agreed, and together with her co-conspirators devised a plot to kill the Sun King. On the 5th of March 1679, Voisin visited the royal court, intending to provoke the king's death. She carried with her a poisoned petition, which when handled by the king would be absorbed by his skin and subsequently kill him. However, that day there were too many people trying to give him petitions. Unable to get near, her plot failed. A week later, while on her way to meet her associate, Catherine Trianon, Voisin was arrested. Although at the time, police had no suspicions of her plot to kill the king, they had been ordered to round up alchemists and fortune tellers suspected of selling poisons. This investigation came as a result of the affair of the poisons, a major murder scandal which began in 1677. In February of that year, the fortune teller named Magdalene de Lagrange was arrested on charges of forgery and murder, yet she tried to bargain her way out of trouble, claiming that she had information about other crimes involving members of the royal court. The chief of police, Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie, was tasked with looking into this and rooting out all poisoners. The subsequent investigation led to accusations of witchcraft, murder, abduction of children, and satanic rituals. Eventually, Voisin's enemy, Marie Beauce, was arrested, and in 1679, she singled out Voisin as the mastermind behind the secret network of the distribution of poison. Following her arrest, Voisin was imprisoned and interrogated. Her network of associates were also arrested. Unlike others, who were also questioned by authorities, it's believed that she wasn't subject to torture at this time, yet, because police knew of her alcoholic ways, they provided her with a constant flow of alcohol, meaning she was drunk during interrogations. Initially, La Voisin denied all claims, telling authorities that any client wishing to buy poison was referred to Marie Bosse. However, by October, she admitted to having sold poison and magical services to several nobles, some of whom were members of the royal court. After this, La Voisin was sure not to reveal anything else. When asked to give more names, she replied saying, "Paris is full of this kind of thing, and there is an infinite number of people engaged in this evil trade." Although La Voisin had admitted to some involvement, her actions didn't deserve the death penalty, so her accusers focused on her alleged abortion services. The authorities claimed that La Voisin injected syringes into the bodies of pregnant women which aborted fetuses, burned the bodies, and then buried them in her garden. She denied all of it. Despite a confident front, La Voisin was very afraid that she'd be asked about her visits to the royal court. Fortunately for her, police had no idea about her plot to kill the king. They also didn't know about the black masses that she conducted or her connection to Montespan. Despite the lack of evidence gathered against her, on the 17th of February 1680, La Voisin was tried and convicted of witchcraft. As a result, she was sentenced to be burnt by the stake. Before her execution, it's believed that La Voisin was interrogated and tortured by having her legs crushed. Yet, strangely, shortly before her execution, a lady described how La Voisin was able to move so freely and seemed so healthy that it did not seem possible for her to have been subjected to torture. In any case, she didn't confess, and on the 22nd of February 1680, La Voisin was burnt alive in public on the Place de Grève. On her way to the stake, La Voisin is said to have desperately pushed away the hay which was piled up around her. It wasn't until after her death that the dark truth of her schemes were revealed. La Voisin's daughter disclosed her list of clients, the arranging of the black masses, the connection to Montespan, and the attempt to poison the king. Her words were confirmed by the testimonies of La Voisin's former associates. It's estimated that she was involved in the deaths of between 1,000 to 2,500 people through her network of abortion providers, black masses, and poison. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on these chilling historical tales. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments, and if you have any suggestions, also be sure to leave them in the comments. And anyway, I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.